Hello and welcome to Sound Design for New Media Week 9. As you know, this week we're going to start thinking a lot more about video games, but that doesn't mean that you can just discard all the information that you have received so far in this course. In fact, the information that you have received in this course is very relevant to the problem that you're going to be trying to solve in these last 5 weeks of the semester, in which you're trying to design sound for a very specific problem. But think about the problem that you're going to have in front of you in a very similar way to the design problems that you have faced so far in this semester. Um, so today we're going to run through a few important topics. The first one, we're going to try to define what a game is. Second, we're going to try to define what a video game is and how it's different from a normal game. Then we're going to think about how do people get involved in games from interaction to an emotional perspective. And then we're going to go just through a couple of important concepts to have in the back of your head for the remainder of the semester. Something important, and I saw varying quality of references in the assignments that I was marking. Something important to have in mind is uh, having good references for what you're doing. So you're going to be getting some readings every week. Please do read those. All of these first couple of these first three references are books that I'm going to keep referring to. The Karpuzis one and the Karen Collins one are available through the library. This first one is not available digitally through the library, so it's not a required text. I think it's pretty good. You can get it in Amazon for something like $25 if you're interested, but it's not a requirement. Something that I did notice going through your assignments is that the referencing style sometimes wasn't the best, and it gets a lot more confusing for video games. So I would suggest that you have a look at the video game style guide and reference manual, where it was going to tell you how to uh, have a reference on how to spell some words. Do you need hyphens? Do you don't need hyphens? That kind of thing. But it also tells you how to reference games properly. So please have a look at this. The reference, the style guide and reference manual is a very good reference to have in the back of your mind for when you're writing your assignment. And a couple of other very good references in terms of journals that you can have a look at are these journals. These last two you can access through the UCIT library website, and the International Journal of Computer Game Research has a lot of freely available articles. I think it's in its second or third year, and they were having a promotion where pretty much at least half of the content is freely available. So please do have a look at these references and make sure that you have interesting and valid references for your assignment. So let's move on to content for this week. And I guess the most important definition for these next 5 weeks is that of what's a game. And the reference I find very useful is from that Yule book. And he says that a game is a rule-based system with a variable and quantifiable outcome where different outcomes are assigned different values. The player exerts effort in order to influence the outcome. The player feels emotionally attached to the outcome, and the consequences of the activity are negotiable. So what does that mean? Rule-based system, very important. In not doesn't matter which game you're playing, whether it's a baseball or soccer in a physical kind of sense, to baseball or soccer in a video game kind of sense, or if you're playing Candy Crush and a few games that I'm going to keep mentioning, there are rules to what you can do within that game, and that's what sets the interactions and what can happen in that game. It's all completely ruled by rules. Um, there is a quantifiable outcome typically, so there is usually a winner and a loser, or a certain amount of points that can be gained from a certain activity. Sometimes it's not necessarily that numerical or categorical. Sometimes you can have something that's a little bit more open, different endings in some more open games, but there's still an outcome of what you're doing. And again, not always, but very often, you will find that outcomes are assigned different values. So something might be worth 100 points, something might be worth 500 points, depending on how you play within the game. That is, as I was saying, not completely true for some games that are a lot more open, but generally 95% of games might follow something like that. Now, something really important is that the player exerts an effort in order to influence the outcome. You have to be invested in the game to try for something to happen. You can play something, of course, and have zero involvement or zero, um, emotional involvement in the game, but it is not really uh, playing a game in the stricter sense of the word. So usually you would feel emotionally attached to the outcome. Uh, Otherwise, you can consider it as doing something else. It's not what the game strictly is there for. And finally, the consequences of the activity are negotiable. So what happens after you achieve these 100 points? You are the best ever, or if you lose, you feel bad. There's usually consequence of the activity of the game. So by defining the what the game is trying to achieve, you can start thinking of the design problem that you're going to have at hand in a clear way, hopefully. Then, if we move to video games in particular, Jewel again says that video games are two things at the same time, in that they are real uh, as a baseball or a card game would be in real life, in that there's rules that you have to actually interact and abide by. And winning or losing, again, is a real event. Those consequences are real. However, when you win a game by, like the slide says, they're slaying a dragon or scoring a goal, those are not real dragons or real goals. It's something fictional. So there is this half reality in video games where the rules and the structure aspect of the game are the same as if it was a real game, but the worlds in which you are inhabiting are not real. Then, thinking about how we get emotionally involved in games, it's important to understand, first of all, why do we play games, and then we're going to move on to how we actually get emotionally involved in games. So why do we play games? There are a few from the Emotion in Games book. They give a few reasons of why we might want to play games, and they go from general to fictional to representational. So in general, it's why would we play games? Because they're something that happens socially. For example, we join soccer or baseball team in real life or in a video game, or you see everyone playing Candy Crush and you want to play Candy Crush. You're interested in the thrill that games um, give you. You're curious about it. So those are valid reasons of why people would generally play video games or games in general. Then there are the functional or rules reasons why someone would play a game, which is a little bit more involved. You know the game well. You're interested in winning. You're interested in problem solving, for example, for puzzle games. And very big one in uh, virtual and real gambling there's an element of luck that you're trying to beat, if that's the right word for it, um, and also acquiring stuff. So if you think about virtual gambling, and if you think that's a game, then those last two are why you might want to play those games. And finally, there's the representational and fictional aspects of a game. These are games that also have a narrative to it, although you can think about a narrative in sports as well. But the um, easier games to think about when you think about narrative are things like either real life role playing games or role playing games as a video game, where there's a story attached to the game. There's some emotional aspects that hopefully the game is trying to elicit, and you feel some agency in the result of this story. So there is a few reasons why we might want to play games. And again, think about all of this when you're as a designer. How do you engage with some of these aspects of a game that can make your sound design in specific more attractive to more people? So how do we then get involved in games? Calleja and Carpus is in that book as well. So this reference by Calleja is quite good as well, which is called "In Game from Immersion to Incorporation," and the reading for this week comes from that book. And he says there's a pyramid of involvement in as you start playing a video game, how you start becoming more and more involved into the game. So in a very superficial way, you are just wakefulness. There's a state of wakefulness in which you are just kind of alert that a game exists. As soon as the game captures your attention, and you might start playing a game at that point, you start getting some involvement in the game. You start paying more and more and more attention until you reach a state of involvement where you are actually involved in the game. You want to, for example, understand how the rules work, or how do you use the controller to achieve certain things in the game, until you reach the point of incorporation in which you are completely and heavily involved in the game. Now, this thing happens in a few different, you can think of them as a different pyramids that are concentric. And the model from Calleja has several aspects of the game that are required to achieve that perfect involvement in the game, where you're like almost like one, like Neo in the Matrix, but with the game that you're playing. So you will recognize that macro involvement, where it's just that state in which you're barely barely aware of the game, and then the micro involvement when you start getting involved in the game. So there are different aspects of the game in which you are going to start getting involved. One is the kinesthetic. That means just the movement. For example, and this relates a lot to controllers in a video game. So you start thinking about, if you push your pad to a certain direction, what's going to happen with the character or the car or whatever you're using in your game. As you start becoming better at that, you start getting more and more involved. You start thinking about the spatial aspects of the game, how those space as a constraint or as a feature in the game affects what you do. You start thinking about shared means, what you do with other players within the game. Narrative, if there's a narrative in the game, how is the story progressing? Affective is that of how the game affects you. If it's a horror game, are you involved really in what the game is trying to tell you, to represent? And finally, ludic, which completely refers to the game aspects and rules of the game. What Calleja says is that you might start to get involved in one aspect, and you it is very hard to be involved in all of the aspects and learn the rules of all of the aspects at the same time. So you might be a little bit more involved in, for example, understanding how the player moves when you touch a controller. And then you start thinking about how you're going to, for example, play with someone else. If it's a sports game, you first understand how the controllers work so that you can score lots of goals. And then you start thinking about how you're going to do that with someone else. So not all of the aspects are going to converge at the same time. Some of the aspects will converge at different times, so that when you are at the center, you are not only really good in terms of controllers and playing the video game, but you're also emotionally invested in what the game is giving you. This is very important to think about. So framework perhaps on how you're going to be designing sound for the game. How do you make this easier for the player? How does it enhance some narrative aspects of the game so that the player becomes completely involved in what the game is doing? So now it's time to start thinking about the functions of game audio. So there are some very obvious ones, like adding emotion through, for example, music, through to a particular scene or a particular part of a game. A very important one is that of feedback. If you Mario Bros, you're going to see that I keep using the same examples over and over, but Mario Bros, you hit a block, sound of a coin appears, you know that you got that coin. You can identify goals by using sound or symbols. If you reach a certain place and it's maybe ambiguous visually, if you can, sound can tell you that you have reached a goal. You can reinforce elements, for example, with dialogue. That you can use this, for example, in narratives, and something that we're going to be thinking about a lot more in following weeks, which is that of adding immersion or adding realism, and what that realism is. So think about intentional sounds in games. What and sound design, and being very intentional about what you want to achieve. If you think about these sort of machines that are very old, what was sound creating in these machines? So there's two things that you can think that the sound for these machines was doing. One, it is providing feedback to the user of what's happening, but second, it's trying to elicit a response, and that response is that of like excitement. If you go to a pinball arcade or a pokey machine place, you're going to hear that there's these sounds that are exciting, and they're trying to attract you, and they're trying to provide some sense of excitement to what you're doing. So it's a very I don't know if crude is the right word, but it's a very obvious way of using sound to create something. A somewhat more ambiguous example is Pong, and we're going to have a look at this a little bit in a lot more detail in a couple of weeks. But how intentional are the sounds of Pong? Now, the sounds of Pong that you could hear are the sounds that the chip could make. It's not that like the designer could do. He didn't have a very broad sonic palette. So is that sound design at all? If it's just a very simple interaction of something hitting the ball hitting the player. So it's a very, 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 very simple sound design, but I believe that it's a sound design. And does it work? I think it works. It gives you feedback on at least on what's happening on screen. So some concepts that you might want to revise and that you will find useful through the semester. And it's that of defining interactivity and nonlinearity. So interactivity in its strictest sense is not being able to read or interpret media, like the slide says there, in one's own way. What does that mean? It's not like choose your own adventure. Is that really interactive? Did you ever have one of those books where you could go to a certain bit and um, uh, have two choices. So is that interactive? I think it is, because you're acting with agency with that media. If you're just reading something and interpreting it in your own way, it's not really interactive. There has to be some certain sense of agency. So yeah, those choose your own adventures is a very crude example of interactivity in that you're acting with agency. Now, if you're thinking about audio, there's further distinctions to this interactivity. Interactive audio uh, are it's events that react directly to what the player is doing. Again, Mario Bros. You push a switch, there's a sound that happens. So that is interactive audio. Then think about adaptive audio, and that is something that is changing as you play and certain conditions are met. The typical example is the heart sound that starts becoming louder and quicker or something like that as your health diminishes. You can think that is a very, very the lowest hanging fruit for adaptive audio. And then there's dynamic audio, which starts getting a little bit more interesting in that it reacts both to the gameplay environment, so what's out of your reach, but also the actions that are taken by the player. So it's a combination of the rules from the world and what you're doing in those um, rules. Now, nonlinearity refers to the fact that you can have many choices in a game. And again, thinking about those very early examples, choose your own adventure. That's a non-linear medium in that you could have different avenues in the book. Now, just a few pointers to finish up this lecture. Um, when you're playing a video game, are you interacting with sound or you are just listening to it? And this is a very open question, and it's just something to get you thinking about what you're going to be doing. Is it something that you that gives you some sort of information back, or it is something that you're actually and actively changing? And at what point does one become the other? So again, very open questions, something for you to think about while you're developing your assignment. Now, this is the last slide for this, and the last thing that I would like to discuss. And I would like you to think about designing an experience with intentionality. And what does that mean? It means that every aspect is not completely left to chance, but you have had some agency in creating the design that you're going to deliver. And we're going to think a lot. We're going to talk about more about. We're going to talk about more about realism and immersion in following classes. But let's leave it at that, and know that there's going to be some topics about this in following lectures. Lastly, two things to think about while creating this, and some words that you might want to think about and include in your design intent. Think about synchronicities, which is the union of sound and vision, when your visual experience is paired to the sound that you hear. And think about self-sound, sounds made by the character you're playing. Again, the example of the heart is it's a very good example. Yeah, it helps a player feel like they're actually in the world. But yeah, we'll talk about that a lot more in following classes. This is just a teaser of things that we're going to be thinking about later, but something important to start considering now as you prepare your assignment.